Scott Alexander, and in this video I'll be continuing my analysis of Maimonides' 26 Propositions of Aristotelian Philosophy located in his introduction to Volume 2 of his Guide of the Perplexed. In this video I'll be dealing with what I call his motion propositions, which are propositions 4 through 9. I'm going to briefly introduce the whole concept of motion and then go through each of the 6 propositions of motion. Now I'll explain how Maimonides will use these propositions in his grand proof for the existence of God in his next chapter of the Guide. Now, the general importance of the concept of motion for Maimonides was the realization that all things in our world are constantly in motion, constantly changing. Our universe is first and foremost a universe of motion. But the ultimate mover of the heavens and the earth must be unmoving and incorporeal in order to avoid infinite regress. Otherwise, you would always have to ask, who moved him? It follows that there can be no other mover but God. The first proposition in this group is the proposition of change. Proposition 4. There are 4 categories of change. Substantial change is the creation and destruction of new substances. Quantitative change is when something grows or decreases. Qualitative change alters the characteristics of existing substances, and change of place is from one location to another. The term motion usually specifies change of place, but can be used for all changes. In this proposition, we learn the names of the 4 kinds of changes: substantial, qualitative, quantitative, and change of place. We also begin to look at the complicated relationship between motion and change. Let's go through the 4 changes. Anything new shows signs of substantial change, as it is a new substance. Anything growing or shrinking is called quantitative change. Anything altering its color or temperature is called qualitative change, and anything going from here to there is changing its place. How will Maimonides use Proposition 4? In the next chapter, he'll use it to show that the action that's keeping everything in our world moving and enabling everything to acquire form must fall into one of these 4 categories of change. Now, is there a problem with this proposition? The problem is, should substantial change be counted as a change or motion? Substantial change occurs when new things emerge. The issue comes up with changes, new things emerging, through a process that we can't actually see with our eyes, like the imperceptible emergence of new leaves in plants, the replacement of old forms with new forms in matter, and the greatest change of all, creation ex nihilo. In these cases, we can't actually see a change from one state or place to another state or place. Now, how should we resolve this problem? The answer, generally, to the problematic of substantial change seems to be that all 3 of those inceptions are going to be called changes. And that's because they change from what was not to what is. Aristotle and Maimonides insist on most of those changes also being called motions in some sense, especially in our physical world, since they're a motion to something new. Even imperceptible motions are a sort of motion, as they hold on to what they are. For example, a rock at the bottom of the sea is holding on against forces of change. The next proposition emphasizes this linkage, focusing on the relation of motion and change. Proposition 5 reads, "Every motion is change and is the transition from potentiality to actuality." Maimonides will use this proposition, identifying motion and change, in the next chapter to show that, number 1, motion is change. Number two, that both are divisible, and that everything divisible is a physical body. The key that links motion and change is they are both divisible. Briefly, change and motion must be divisible, since there's a division in every change between the start of the change and its finish. The larger point is that motion, change, and all physical bodies are always divisible and are always correlative with each other because of their correlative divisibility. Now, why does Maimonides think that this proposition is true? The explanation of motion and change is a major continual source of problems in philosophy due to their innate difficulty. This is especially true with the substantial change, which is the inception of new things. Still, Maimonides insists that motion is the most comprehensive category. In this, he follows Heraclitus' rule that everything is in motion, panta rei, everything flows. Even substantial motion, the flow from potential existence to actual existence, is a motion, for he says in Proposition 5 that motion is the transition from potentiality to actuality. Nonetheless, Maimonides carved out an exception. He rejects the application of the term motion to the inception of certain kinds of new things, new minds or souls, and also creation ex nihilo. These are changes that take place without motion. In the world of mind, thoughts develop, but they do not move. Only bodies move. Changes in the world of thought, including the creation of thought itself, does not take place in time. Similarly, the creation of the universe from nothing does not take place in time. By contrast, the generation of new rabbits in our world of time and motion is still the motion of a transition, even though it's imperceptible and sudden the moment the new rabbit appears. It's still a transition in matter. But we would not say this about the making of new human minds. The next proposition, Proposition 6, considers the four modes of motion in our world. It reads, the motion of a thing is either substantial, accidental, externally forced, or partial, that is to say, of a part. This partial motion is a type of accidental motion. Maimonides, as part of this proposition, then gives a brief explanation of each of these four. He says, substantial motion is from place to place. An accidental motion occurs when a thing's black color moves with it. A forced motion is like the motion of a rock thrown upward. Partial motion is like a nail in a ship. When the ship moves, the nail moves. When the whole moves, every part moves. The distinction between Proposition 4 and Proposition 6 is that the former is the fourfold classification of all changes, while this one describes the four modes in which motion takes place. Now, the modes of motion break down into two broad categories: substantial motion and accidental motion. Substantial motion is the motion of an independent substance itself moving from one place to another. Accidental motion, by contrast, describes the motion of any qualities of that motion which move when that substance moves, such as its color, its coloration. The next one is called partial or participative motion. Partial motion is a type of accidental motion, the example being a nail carried along with a moving ship. In true accidents, like the motion of a black color carried along by a black cloth, the color doesn't have independent existence, unlike the nail, which can be separated from the ship. Nonetheless, both the blackness and the nail are called types of accidental motion because they're both carried along. This is important because Maimonides thought that the soul moves with the body in something like that, in a partial participative motion, like the nail on a ship. Now, the last type of motion is called forced motion. It's a type of substantial motion, a motion of the whole substance from place to place, except that in this case, it's against the substance's nature or its will. Now, Maimonides will use Proposition 6 in the next chapter to show that the motion of the cosmic spheres is not like human motion, although both are moved by their souls. In both, the souls bear an accidental relationship to their bodies because in both cases their souls are carried along with their bodies, again, like a nail on a ship. The only difference is that the sphere and its soul will keep on moving. Human souls have to stop from time to time moving. Now let me explain. Maimonides' grand proof of God's existence stems in part from the ancient outmoded cosmology of a divine unmoved mover inducing the celestial spheres to move everything on earth. What are these spheres? These spheres are ever-moving crystalline globes surrounding the earth like a glass onion on which stars and planets are fixed. In the 4th chapter of Volume 2 of the Guide, Maimonides emphasized the uniqueness of this spherical motion as he understood it, following this ancient cosmology. He wrote that the circular motion of the sphere must be due to the action of some idea which produces this particular kind of motion, but as ideas are only possible in intellectual beings, the heavenly sphere is an intellectual being. So its idea is its eternal desire for the unmoved mover. This whole scheme is based on an earth-centered conception of the universe. These spheres move because of their souls, which move them voluntarily. I want to stress that I'm not going to defend this cosmology of the spheres simply because there are no cosmic celestial spheres. If you want to substitute in your thought the idea of a general heavenly motion, you're certainly free to do so, but you need to know about the spheres in order to understand the propositions. The general idea behind this is that there must be a separate mover behind the sphere's eternal motion, and this mover could only be God. That is the point of Proposition 6 for Maimonides, and the reason that he's interested in the participative motion of the souls with their spheres. Next, I'm going to explain the division that's inevitably found in all change, and that's because Proposition 7 is about the divisibility of change. It reads, anything changeable, movable, or corporeal is divisible, but anything immovable or incorporeal is indivisible. This concept of the divisibility of motion, matter, and time is called the space-time motion continuum. It's a major doctrine in Aristotle, and it emerged from a dispute that he had with Zeno over the nature of motion. Zeno, Parmenides, and the Eleatic philosophers of southern Italy argued that everything was all one, and that nothing ever really moves or changes. But by showing that space, time, and motion can be infinitely divided, Aristotle destroyed this static picture of the universe. Now, why does Maimonides think that this proposition of divisibility is true? In change, as in motion, there's the beginning of a change, which will be followed by the end of the change. It's the basic division occurring in all changing things. At the beginning and at the end, the changing object is at rest, but the whole change includes and unites both states of rest. In the initial state, the potential for the change exists, and in the final state, that potential has been actualized. These two states, actuality and potentiality, are different things, even though the whole change contains both. That's why in any change, a division exists between the initial state and the final state. Thus, as Proposition 7 states, anything changeable is divisible. But the same is also true of motion, since every motion is a transition moving from here to there, and is thus divisible in that motion. You could also divide time and space the same way, and correlatively with motion. Because corporeal physical bodies constantly change, they're always divisible. Even inanimate objects like rocks reveal types of change, since the rock must constantly, though imperceptibly, resist forces that would force it from its place of rest. The rocks are changing, decaying, resisting, holding on, and therefore they're divisible at any point in those changes. On the other hand, those things that are not subject to division are not in motion and are not physical bodies. I'm talking now about the incorporeal, non-physical, spiritual entities like God, souls, minds, and the forms that inform all things. Thus, God is indivisible, motionless, and incorporeal. God is the unmoved mover of all causal chains in our world just because of those characteristics, since they ensure that God is not just one more link in an impossible infinite regress. There is one more important characteristic of accidental motion, which will be illustrated by the next proposition. Proposition 8 says that anything that moves accidentally must come to rest, as this motion is not due to itself. It cannot go on moving forever. Maimonides thinks that this is true, that this eventual pause of all accidental motions is true, because any accident of a substance could either exist or not exist. It's either going to move or it's going to stop, one or the other. One of these two possibilities must be realized in infinite time. Someday either possibility will be realized. So, since it's possible for it to either move or rest, whatever moves accidentally will eventually come to rest. Its motion will eventually be interrupted, and it'll come to a halt. Now we should then expect, based on this, that since the motion of the heavens is accidental, the heavens should also someday cease moving and come to a halt, unless some other force keeps them moving. But we observe that the heavens continue to move and have never stopped. They have never ceased moving. Therefore, there must be a separate external force that keeps them going. But that leads us to the next question. What is it that makes the Aristotelian cosmic spheres move at all? According to Maimonides, they move for the same reason we do, because both humans and spheres possess a source of motion, which is called a soul. The question is whether that soul itself is moving. The answer given is that the soul, because of its incorporeality, is unmoved essentially. And that's because, generally, incorporeals don't move. Souls don't move. Nonetheless, the soul moves accidentally with the body as it causes that body to move. It's carried along by the body. Since this motion is accidental, it must eventually come to a halt. Let's take an example. When you drive, the car must come to a stop, since you'll eventually run out of gas or have to go to sleep. The car doesn't have its own principle of motion. You're the driver, but you're also along for the ride, and so you must stop when it stops. Let's try this with walking. When you walk, your soul moves with you as an accident of your body's motion, moving accidentally with that motion. Now let's apply the proposition to this. Since it's possible that you'll come to a stop, you and your soul will eventually come to a stop, as all possibilities will in time be realized. On the same logic, unless some other mover is present, the cosmic spheres and the souls of those spheres would also have to come to a halt. They have no internal source for their eternal motion. Therefore, the unmoved mover keeping them in rotation must be God. The next proposition, Proposition 9, is about the continuity of motion in our ever-moving world. Proposition 9 reads, any physical body that moves another body can do so only when it itself is already in motion. Now, why does Maimonides think that this proposition is true? The key is that whenever the mover comes in contact with the moved object, the mover itself receives motion from it in reciprocity. Everything moves everything else. The first domino moves the second, but when they come into contact, the motion of the first domino is itself changed by that contact. The outcome is that the system never ceases its motion. This is the rule for all physical things. But since God is the final purpose for the motion of the spheres, he is not himself in motion, and that is why he can be the ultimate unmoved mover. The motion he engenders does not touch him or have a reciprocal effect upon him. Now, Maimonides applies this proposition in the next chapter to show that for the celestial spheres to move our world, they must already be in motion. But to find the cause moving those spheres without going through an infinite regress of prior causes, you must ultimately come to the existence of an unmoved mover. Now, in the next video in the series, I'm going to talk about the force propositions, the propositions of force, which are propositions 10 through 12. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. Thank you very much for listening. You may contact me at scottmalexander@rcn.com with comments, questions, or criticism. Please click on the YouTube description panel to find links to all documents mentioned in this video. Please visit my website to see my commentary essays on each chapter of Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, currently completed through the first volume of the guide, and now including my commentary to the introduction to the second volume. On that website, you'll also find associated essays I've written, podcasts, videos, and important links. And of course, like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe, and please hit the YouTube notification bell. Thank you very much.